At 85 years old, David rarely thought about the summer of 1945. The memories were a locked room in his mind, the key long lost. But when a call from the local sheriff's department informs him that an old toy wagon axle has been unearthed at the new construction site on the edge of town, the door to that room creaks open. The axle belonged to his older brother Robert and his friends, the 5 children who vanished from a sun-drenched suburban street and were never seen again. It's amazing how a single discovery can unravel a mystery that has been silent for generations. Before we begin this incredible story, I'm curious to know, what's the oldest unsolved mystery in your hometown? Share it in the comments below because every forgotten story deserves to be heard. David gripped the phone receiver so tightly his knuckles turned white. The voice on the other end, a young woman who introduced herself as Detective Sarah Miller, was patient but firm. She asked if he would be willing to come down to the site. "We just want to confirm," she said gently. "You're the only immediate family member left in the area, Mr. Freeman." He was the only one left, period. His parents had gone to their graves with hollowed-out eyes, forever looking down the street for a 10-year-old boy who would never come home. The other families had either moved away or passed on, the sharp edges of their grief worn down by the relentless friction of time. David agreed, his voice a dry rasp. He hung up the phone and stared at his hands. They were the wrinkled, liver-spotted hands of an old man, but for a moment he saw them as they were in 1945, the hands of a 15-year-old, slick with sweat as he tried to fix the chain on his bicycle, ignoring the sound of his brother's laughter drifting from the end of the block. He was supposed to be watching him. That was the last thing his mother had said before she went inside to start dinner. "You watch your brother, David. Don't let them wander off." But he had let them wander. The bicycle chain was stubborn, and by the time he'd finally fixed it, the street was silent. The laughter was gone. The little red wagon was gone. His brother Robert, his friends John, Michael, and Thomas, and the little girl from next door, Mary, were all gone. The police car ride to the edge of town was quiet. David watched the familiar streets of his youth blur into the newer, unfamiliar suburbs. The construction site was a scar of red clay on what used to be a vast, overgrown field. For as long as he could remember, that land had been nothing but a tangle of weeds and wildflowers, bordered by a crumbling stone wall. Now, bulldozers sat silent like giant, sleeping beasts, and the air smelled of diesel and upturned earth. Detective Miller met him at the yellow police tape. She was younger than his own granddaughter, with kind, serious eyes. She led him to a small patch of ground where a piece of rusted metal lay on a blue tarp. It was an axle, with 2 warped, spoked wheels still attached. The red paint was almost entirely gone, eaten away by 70 years in the damp Ohio soil, but David would have recognized it anywhere. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and ran a trembling finger over the hubcap. Faintly, beneath the rust, he could just make out the embossed letters, Coaster King. It was his 10th birthday present, David said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He saved up for months to buy it, polished it every single day. He looked up at the detective. "Where did you find it?" She pointed to a deep trench a few yards away, where a backhoe had been digging a foundation. The operator hid it about 4 feet down, said it was lucky he didn't crush it completely. David stood up and looked around at the raw, excavated earth. This field had always been the unofficial border of their neighborhood, a place for adventures, for games of hide-and-seek that lasted until dusk. But on that day, the game had never ended. "We searched this field for weeks," he murmured, more to himself than to the detective. "The whole town did. Police, volunteers. We walked every inch of it. How could we have missed this?" Detective Miller's expression was compassionate. 70 years is a long time, Mr. Freeman. The ground shifts. Things get buried deeper than anyone could search by hand. The official story, the one that had settled over the town like a suffocating dust, was that the children had been taken by a transient, someone passing through on the nearby railway line. It was a story that offered no comfort, no answers, just a vague and terrifying emptiness. But the wagon being here, buried deep in the earth, didn't fit that story. A kidnapper on the move wouldn't have taken the time to dig a 4-foot hole to bury a toy. A new feeling, one he hadn't felt in decades, began to smolder in David's chest. It wasn't hope for his brother's return. He had made peace with that loss long ago. It was something sharper, more urgent. It was the need for a final answer. For the first time in his adult life, he felt a clear purpose. He had to know what really happened in this field. He turned to Detective Miller. I want to help, he said, his voice stronger now. I remember things. About this place. About that day. She nodded slowly. Okay, Mr. Freeman. Let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything you remember. For the next week, the construction site was shut down, and David's quiet life was turned upside down. He spent hours with Detective Miller, walking her through his memories, painting a picture of a world that no longer existed. But his memories, filtered through the fog of time and trauma, weren't enough. He needed facts. On a whim, he went to the county records office, a dusty basement room filled with the smell of old paper. He wanted to see who had owned this land back in 1945. He spent an entire afternoon poring over brittle, hand-drawn property maps until he found it. The Overgrown field wasn't a field at all back then. It was the extensive backyard of a small, isolated house that sat at the very edge of the development. David stared at the name on the deed, Charles Thompson. The name meant nothing at first, just another forgotten name from the past. But as he sat there, a vague image began to form in his mind. A man. A shadow, really. Someone the neighborhood kids whispered about. A quiet, solitary man who lived alone and rarely spoke to anyone. They called him Mr. Thompson, and the one rule every child on the block knew was to never, ever kick your ball into his yard. David remembered his own mother warning him and Robert. You stay away from that house, she'd said. That man, he likes his privacy. It was a simple, harmless memory, the kind of thing parents say about any reclusive neighbor. But now, connected to the discovery of his brother's wagon on that very property, the memory felt sinister. He took his findings to Detective Miller. She listened patiently, making notes in a small black book. A reclusive neighbor, she repeated, her expression thoughtful. It's a long shot, Mr. Freeman. The original investigators would have talked to everyone on the block. Did they? David pressed. Or did they just talk to the friendly families? Would they have pushed their way into the home of a man everyone was a little afraid of? A man with no wife or children to vouch for him? Sarah didn't have an answer, but she saw the conviction in his eyes. She promised she would look into Charles Thompson's background. It was a small thread, almost nothing, but it was the only one they had. 2 days later, she called him. Her voice was different. The professional calm was gone, replaced by a tense energy. Mr. Freeman, I think you are onto something, she said. I need you to come down to the station. At the station, Sarah laid a thin file on the table between them. Charles Thompson died in 1986, she began. No known family, the house was torn down years ago, and the property was sold to the city. That's why it was left to become an overgrown lot. But that's not the interesting part. She slid a document across the table. It was a military service record. Charles Thompson was dishonorably discharged from the Army in 1944. The reason listed was unstable and violent behavior towards his fellow soldiers. David stared at the words. Unstable and violent. The quiet, reclusive neighbor was a man with a documented history of violence. He had come home from the war a broken man and moved into that isolated house just months before the children disappeared. The official story of a random transient began to crumble, replaced by a much more terrifying possibility. The monster wasn't a stranger passing through. He might have been living at the end of their street the entire time. This changes everything, Sarah said, her voice low. It's not just a hunch anymore. We have a viable local suspect for the first time in 70 years. She explained that with this new information, she could get a warrant to have the property properly searched before the construction company was allowed to resume their work. They could bring in a team with ground-penetrating radar. If there's anything else buried on that lot, David, she said, using his first name for the first time, we're going to find it. The next morning, David stood at the edge of the lot, watching a team of forensic experts work. The air was cold, and a fine mist hung over the red clay. A technician pushed a machine that looked like a lawnmower back and forth across the ground, his eyes fixed on a small screen. David felt a nervous energy he hadn't experienced since he was a young man. He was standing on the verge of an answer he had waited a lifetime for, and he was terrified of what it might be. After several hours, the technician called out, motioning for Detective Miller. He pointed to his screen. We've got an anomaly here, he said, right on the old property line. It's man-made, rectangular, about 6 feet down. It's not on any of the city blueprints. Sarah and David walked over to where he was pointing. The ground looked no different from the rest of the lot, but beneath their feet, the radar was showing a hidden void, a hollow space, a secret buried in the earth. "Get the excavator," Sarah ordered, her voice tight. The large machine rumbled to life. David held his breath as the bucket bit into the soil, pulling away layer after layer of dirt and rock. And then, it struck something hard with a dull thud. The workers jumped into the pit with shovels, clearing the remaining dirt away. They uncovered the edge of 2 thick wooden planks. They were cellar doors, old, rotted, and swollen with moisture, but unmistakably the entrance to a hidden root cellar. 2 officers used crowbars to pry the doors open. They came apart with a groan of splintering wood, releasing a gust of stale, musty air that smelled of damp earth and decay. David's heart pounded against his ribs. Detective Miller shone a high-powered flashlight into the darkness below, and what the beam revealed made the world fall silent. There at the bottom of the earthen steps, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, was the rest of the little red wagon. Its body was intact, the iconic logo still faintly visible on its side. And nestled inside it, and on the ground around it, were small, heartbreaking shapes, the tiny, fragile bones of 5 children. David let out a sound, a ragged sob that had been trapped in his chest for 70 years. He staggered back, and Sarah caught his arm, steadying him. He had found them. After a lifetime of wondering, of imagining, of fearing the worst, he had found his brother. They were home. The resolution was swift. The remains were carefully recovered and identified. Robert, Mary, John, Michael, and Thomas. The town's oldest mystery was solved. Charles Thompson, the quiet man at the end of the street, had lured the children onto his property, trapped them in his root cellar, and left them there. The motive was buried with him, but the truth was finally out. A few weeks later, the entire town gathered for a memorial service. 5 small caskets were lowered into the ground, side by side, in the local cemetery. David stood before his brother's new headstone, the first real place he'd had to visit him in 70 years. He placed a hand on the cool granite. The guilt he had carried since he was 15, the heavy burden of that broken bicycle chain, finally began to lift. He couldn't have saved him. He knew that now. The evil that took his brother was not a moment of teenage distraction. It was a man living in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, David looked at his brother's name carved in the stone. He could finally remember Robert not for the way he was lost, but for the bright, laughing, 10-year-old boy who had loved his red wagon more than anything in the world. The locked room in his mind was finally open, and inside, there was no longer a ghost, only the cherished memory of a brother. The truth, in this story, brought a painful but necessary peace. It makes you wonder, is it always better to unearth a painful truth, no matter how long it's been buried, or are some secrets better left in the past to avoid reopening old wounds? We'd love to read your thoughts on this difficult question. If you were moved by David's journey for answers, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories that explore the depths of human resilience.